Growing up, one of the Easter traditions in my family was we would all sit down together and watch the Ten Commandments, or at least part of the Ten Commandments, given how long the movie is. Often it would be on in the background as my parents were making their turkey, ham, or whatever, and it would just run throughout the house for most of the day. And these were some of my fondest memories. I really enjoyed the film as a kid. And it's for whatever reason, it's been probably a decade or so since we've all sat down and watched it. But I figure it's Easter. Let's do something Eastery and let's watch a great old movie. And I figure I do movie reviews now. I'm older, I'm more mature. Let's see if this film holds up. Let's see if it is the cinematic masterpiece that I remember it being. So it's not on any of the not on any of the streaming services as an included movie, but you can get it on YouTube or Amazon Prime for I think 4 or 5. I think to buy it is $10. It's $5 to rent it, and I would definitely recommend the HD movie because it's rare to see a film this old in HD, and that combined with the Technicolor gives a very interesting visual experience. I really miss Technicolor. I like just how bright and vivid it is, and kind of like an Egyptian treasure, it does very much feel with the HD like they scrubbed all the grime off and really made it polished. And you can kind of get a bit more of the feeling of what it was probably like seeing this in theaters. But I guess the question is, does this movie hold up? It's like 3.5 to 4 hours long, depending on whether or not there's the edition and which version of it you're watching. It's like from the 1950s, so the special effects are very primitive. It doesn't have the same filming techniques we have today. The script is a bit stilted and kind of more of a stage actor script than modern movie writing. Does it hold up, or is it just something from nostalgia? And I'm going to say 100% it holds up. And I highly recommend you to go and watch the movie. If you haven't seen it, I think it's worth watching just for it being an important piece of cinematic history. With thousands of extras, the fact that they had to do pretty much all of this practical, just some of the building scenes and the costumes and the set piece, I think alone are worth the price of admission. To sit through this movie, you also just have a very star-studded cast. I don't recognize a lot of the people in this film because it's not from my era. But looking at the other stuff they've been in, obviously Charlton Heston and Vincent Price is in this movie for some reason. I don't know why, but I'm a big fan of Vincent Price and him being in this movie. I hadn't even noticed it really as a kid because I didn't even really know who Vincent Price was. But watching it this time, I'm like, there's a very distinct voice that that guy has. And I looked it up. I'm like, yeah, Vincent Price is in this movie. Also, it is surreal to see movies made in the 50s, 60s because you could never get away with the kind of stuff that you could get away that you can never get away with the kind of stuff that you could get away with back then that you could now. Stuff like Zulu could never be made nowadays. This movie could never be made nowadays. People would complain about whitewashing. They would complain about the fact that like the women look like women and they aren't overweight. They would complain about the fact that there's like direct references to God and it's not historically accurate because we care about that all of a sudden. That the women are acting all subservient. I mean, to be honest though, if Charlton Heston came in and told me something, I'd probably do whatever Charlton Heston. Fucking Charlton Heston, the Giga Chat. And one of the ironies of it is I feel like a lot of these movies, even if they are a bit kind of, I guess the term is orient, I think they do kind of treat their subject matter in a sense with more respect than a lot of the modern stuff. Like if we look at the movie Zulu, people will probably say it's racist because of how it portrays Africans, but the Zulus are shown to be a well-disciplined, organized army that uses military tactics. The fact that they lose is more due to technology than them being just this primitive people who have no idea what they're doing. And that movie more very heavily focuses on kind of the idea of the warrior code, where it's soldier versus soldier, rather than any kind of ideological framework. And something I really like about it's kind of from the Victorian era to the late 1950s is this whole idea of the lost world, these exotic locations, these advanced civilizations that are lost to the sands of time. I really like all that kind of stuff. Even if it has some issues, I really like the movie Atlantis, The Lost Empire for that reason. And while this obviously isn't a Victorian era adventure movie, the way they portray Egypt does very much feel like one of those places that it was this very advanced society that existed long before any sort of history that we tend to remember. So I think one of the main criticisms of this movie, as with some other biblical movies that I like, specifically Noah, is that it's not an accurate adaptation of the Bible. Now I get that if we're complaining about something like The Last Temptation of Christ not being an accurate representation, but I don't think this in any way really attacks or shits on the themes of the book of Exodus and how it's generally interpreted by Christians. And to be honest, in a lot of cases in the Bible, there really isn't a ton to go on. It's quite succinct, and there's not all the personal details and stuff like that. Sometimes you only really get a bit of a hint of that. So if you're going to make it into a movie, you're going to have to take a lot of creative liberties. And of the two really solid movies that were made about the Book of Exodus, this and The Prince of Egypt, this film tended to focus more on kind of a romantic angle, specifically the relationship between Moses and Nefertiti, the woman who ultimately marries Ramses, and his father figure in Seti, with Ramses very much being the villain and kind of the negative foil to Moses. In The Prince of Egypt, on the other hand, it focuses a lot more on Ramses and Moses's relationship as brothers. That there's genuine affection between the two, but that fate and God and the universe, etc., have kind of driven them to a point where they have to be mortal enemies. Although both of them deeply regret it. So this adaptation starts off pretty much like the Book of Exodus. A Hebrew mother decides to put her child in a basket and float it down the Nile in hopes that someone will get it. There's rumors that a deliverer will come and lead the Hebrews out of bondage. They say the word bondage a lot at this movie. And to a modern person, with what that tends to mean, it is kind of funny. It's nothing against the movie, but it is something I can't help but smile at whenever they say it. So they think the deliverer is coming, so Seti orders them to kill the firstborn male child. Once again, there's a lot of one of the things that's I like about the Bible and that kind of convinced me that a lot of it is probably true is it is interesting how certain themes, certain events reading through it. Like so many things in the life of this are direct references to stuff that happened in the Old Testament. And we'll get to some of that in a bit. But once again, the firstborn male child thing is an example of that. I think that happened in Exodus. If that's an adaptation just for the movie, then I apologize. You can take away my Catholic, but he's found by the Pharaoh's sister. Now, it's stated in this that her husband recently died and she was unable to have a child. So I think in this adaptation, they don't pretend that Moses was a baby who they found, like an Egyptian baby that they adopted, but that he's the biological son of Pharaoh's sister. Now, ancient Egypt, we don't exactly know how the succession laws worked, but it wasn't primogeniture as we understand it. The firstborn male son didn't necessarily inherit. There's one theory that the pharaoh was whoever married a specific woman, like the pharaoh's daughter, because incest was allowed. But it seems like in this that Seti is going to try to choose someone from his bloodline in order to be the next pharaoh. So his choices are either Ramses or Moses. Moses being his nephew as the son of his sister, who is still part of his bloodline, even if Ramses is his first son, because in this context, it's not quite as important. And Moses, as played by Charlton Heston, you can already see the traits that will make him such an iconic and transformative figure later in his life. He's kind of skilled at everything he does. He's exceedingly charismatic. I get that later on in the Bible. It says I'm slow of speech or whatever, but he's played by Charlton Heston, so he's chatting. exceedingly charismatic in the role. And he very quickly eclipses his brother Ramsay, who's exceedingly jealous and bitter about it. He leads a campaign that forces the submission of Ethiopia. And not only does he force the submission of Ethiopia, but he also is able to reconcile with them and make them allies of Egypt. Ramses completely screws the pooch on building a treasure city, and Moses takes over the job and starts to do a much better job doing it. Ramses tries to run some offs behind the scenes and accuse Moses of traitor, because Moses already has the kind of the compassion and the inherent goodness that we'll see later in his life. Because when he takes over, he immediately dramatically increases the slaves' rations, gives them time off, like he gives them the Sabbath and some other kind of stuff. So they start to be a lot more productive because it turns out people who are starving and dying can't really produce very much. And there's a scene where he saves a woman from being crushed by a block that turns out to be his biological mother. So he's able to complete the city ahead of schedule. He builds this massive statue of Seti. We have a great scene where they put up an obelisk. A lot of the construction scenes are really the highlight of this movie with the thousands of extras. You don't really see that anymore, nor will you probably ever see it anymore. It's why movies like Waterloo are such treasures that we have them, as they're not CG. They actually got Red Army soldiers to fulfill the roles of the Napoleonic. And with his ascension almost assured, maid to the pharaoh's sister goes to Nefertiri, the woman who Moses had to marry, and tells her that he's actually Hebrew. He's not Egyptian. He's not a royal. And she has a bolt of Hebrew cloth, the blanket that Moses was wrapped in. So Nefertiri doesn't want to marry Ramses because she wants to marry Charlton Heston. Because who doesn't want to? So she kills her by pushing her off a balcony, but Moses is able to tease out the truth from her that she's actually that he is actually a Hebrew. And he goes through an identity crisis. He gets it confirmed by his mother and his biological mother. So to try to find himself, he decides to spend some time as a slave. And he goes and he works in the mud pits. He realizes how horrible the life of the Hebrews are, and he's not sure what he wants to do because he can still become pharaoh or he can go and live with his. And ultimately he kind of comes to the decision that okay, he needs to become pharaoh, and once he becomes pharaoh he can free the Hebrews from bondage and ironically fulfill his role as a deliverer as the head of the Egyptians rather than the head of the Hebrews, which is kind of interesting. Nefertiri succeeds in kind of finding him among the slaves. She takes him out. She convinces him to return. But Moses has to do one last thing before he's back. So Vincent Price, who's the master builder, or as Charlton Heston calls him, the master butcher, has taken a rather attractive slave girl. And I'll say one of the best parts of the movie is pretty much all the women are eye candy. It really shows you how like both men and women have gone downhill 50. The men all like are like in good shape. They have like square jaws. They have like the deep voices. The women are all skinny. They have like long hair. Well, not skinny, but they all look in good shape. They have long hair. They look and act and look and act. I'm not saying I'm a paragon of masculinity myself, certainly, but it is something very kind of shocking. So anyway, so Vincent Price takes this woman to be his concubine, and Moses shows up and kills him. But while he gets killed, this guy here overhears him and finds out that he's Moses, and he goes to Ramses with the information. And Ramses is able to confront Moses before he can get back to the capital and brings him before Seti in chains. And Seti more or less begs him to say that it's not true. It's not true. And he's like, no, I'm a Hebrew and I'll free the slaves if I can. So I think Seti misinterprets him because he basically said he's trying to say that when I become Pharaoh, I'm going to free them. but it's interpreted as he's going to lead them in a revolt against the pharaoh and take power in a military coup. Although, given that he was basically Seti's successor at the time, it doesn't really make sense that he would even need to take power. But regardless, Seti damns his name and leaves his punishment up to Ramses. So Ramses strips him of his titles, doesn't want to execute him because then he'll be a martyr for the Hebrews and for Nefertiri. So he gives him very limited provisions and sends him out into the desert to die. And basically, Moses goes through his 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, and he becomes purified from it. And he somehow manages to survive with basically a day's worth of ration. And he comes across a Bedouin sheikh and his 7 daughters. And they immediately want to take him in because he's like, look, you got Charlton Heston here. I don't have a son. It's Charlton Heston. He's like the biggest Chad ever. I want him to marry one or all of my daughters and create super Bedouins who will conquer all of Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula. Anyway, so Moses spends the next couple of years there becoming a shepherd. He becomes kind of a leader in the local community. He's asked to choose one of the brides, or one of the daughters to be his bride, and he winds up choosing the eldest daughter. And it's kind of it's Moses's character arc has kind of reached its midpoint. He's no longer the prince of Egypt, but he's found peace. He's found happiness away in a different land, and he's would be content there for the rest of his life. However, Joshua shows up. So Joshua is the love of the slave girl that Vincent Price took's life. So she winds up having becoming the mistress of the guy who ratted out Moses to Ramsey in exchange for Joshua being sent to the copper mines of Sinai. The Sinai Peninsula being where Moses is with the shepherds. So he meets up with Moses again. He's like, "Look, Moses, Charlton Heston, we need you to go and save the." And Charlton Heston's like, "Look, I don't want to go do this," but he sees the burning bush on Mount Sinai, and he goes up and sees God. And God, of course, declares. They ask him, what is the name of the nameless God?" And he says, "I am God. I am that I am. I exist." Which I believe translation of Yahweh is either I am that I am, or I alone. Basically, I am the one God. I am the creator of everything. I am on which everything exists. Everything is predicated on my existence. I don't really need a fancy or anything like the various Egyptian gods. And Moses undergoes a spiritual awakening. His hair turns white, and he noticeably ages, but he becomes determined that he's going to go and save the Hebrews. So he goes and confronts Pharaoh. We have the scene where he turns his staff into a cobra, and then the Egyptian priests turn their staffs into cobras, and his cobra eats their cobras. But Ramses isn't like interested in it. He decides not to kill Moses. He instead punishes the Hebrews more, increasing their burdens. So then Moses turns the river red. Now, an interesting aspect of this film is it focuses a lot on the idea of faith, whether or not gods actually exist, and whether or not they care or play a role. Moses, for the first half of the movie, doesn't believe that Yahweh exists because he sees no evidence of it. He's the Hebrews in bondage. He sees that no Messiah has come to rescue or save them or liberate them. Ramses sees no evidence that the Egyptian gods exist. And there's an interesting tendency to kind of uh, attribute the supernatural things to natural phenomena. So when all the plagues wind up happening, Ramses is like, look, there was a discharge of, I don't know, iron or something uh, upstream from the Nile. It turned the river red. The fish died from it. The frogs were driven out of the water. The plague of flies and boils and other stuff came because you had all these rotting corpses. Like, you're just trying to take credit for this other stuff. So then he starts kind of upping the ante. You have the days of darkness. You have the hail that explodes into fire. And you just have things constantly getting ratcheted up. Nefertiri keeps telling Ramses that he has to stay firm because she doesn't want Moses to leave. Also, she's bitter towards Moses that he found his like Bedouin girl in sheep pasture and prefers her to him. And then we ultimately come to the angel of death, which is a really good scene. Where obviously the firstborn of all of the Egyptians happen. A lot of it happens very subtly in the background. There's kind of this, you hear people yelling and that kind of thing. Moses' Egyptian mother actually shows up again and she decides to throw in her lot with, because even if she is an Egyptian, Moses is her son and she loves him unconditionally. I think that's one of the highlights of this film is that she does get a fair amount of screen time. I find she doesn't in a lot of the other adaptations. And there is a very real motherly son affection between the two of them. And when the Hebrews ultimately leave Egypt, she decides to go with them. So, anyways, Pharaoh's firstborn son dies. He agrees to let them go. Nefertiri is just so angry at Moses. She tells Ramses, "Go kill Moses. Bring me this sword with his blood upon it." The parting of the Red Sea happens, which the special effects were really not there, but it's still a great scene. That happens. The Egyptian army gets destroyed. Ramses goes back and is like, "Yeah, he truly is the one true God." And Moses. And then that brings us to the golden calf incident. There's a scene that's awesome, but once again, the special effects are kind of lacking. Where Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and God dictates the Ten Commandments, um, burning them into the stone tablets. Meanwhile, below, Moses has been up on Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. The former Hebrew guy who ratted them out was forced to go with them because he was Hebrew, and he convinces them to build a god of gold, to build the golden calf, and they're going to use that to show that they've reconverted to Egyptian paganism and that they're going to go back to the Egyptian. So Moses comes down and he's really pissed off. Basically they show on screen them committing all the sins that God is telling them not to have. Moses throws the tablets at the golden calf and blows it up. And then we cut to obviously the end of the story, after the wandering, where Moses is allowed to glimpse the land of milk and honey across the River Jordan for his death. So, what can be said about the Ten Commandments? It's an excellent historic epic. Something I really like about it is the dialogue is very hammy and over the top, but it kind of suits like a biblical epic. It really reminds me a lot of a Shakespearean play, like a Shakespearean tragedy, kind of, which I think is very appropriate. And overall, the writing is just great. Sure, it's a little cheesy, but like I said, it's an epic. Epics are supposed to be. Overall, though, I'd say it's arguably the best biblical movie made. I know a lot of people will say Passion of the Christ. A lot of people will also like to say, probably partially, probably because it's a um I don't know, sophisticated opinion that The Prince of Egypt is better. I don't think you can really compare them. I think they're very different movies that set out to do very different things. And I don't think there's anything wrong with liking both of them and saying neither is better than the other, because it's not really a kind of comparing apples to oranges. So if you haven't seen the Ten Commandments, definitely go watch it this Easter or watch it next Easter or just watch it in general. You can't go wrong with Charlton Heston, Vincent Price, and a whole bunch of other notable actors. Great movie. Give it a watch.